everyone, welcome to another Powerplant podcast, and today we're looking at the Paris Agreement, which was agreed upon within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, dealing with greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, adaptation and finance starting in the year 2020. The language of the agreement was negotiated by representatives of 195 countries at the 21st Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC in Paris, and adopted by consensus on the 12th of December 2015. It was opened for signature on the 22nd of April 2016, which was Earth Day, at a ceremony in New York, and as of December 2016, 194 members have signed the treaty, 127 of which have ratified it, which means they've actually they're going to take part in it, apparently. After several European states ratified the agreement in October 2016, there are enough countries that had ratified the agreement that produce enough of the world's greenhouse gases for the agreement to enter force. The agreement went into effect on the 4th of November 2016, so just over 3 months ago. The head of the Paris Conference, France's Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, said this ambitious and balanced plan is a historic turning point in the goal of reducing global warming. 1 year on, the ratification of the Paris Agreement was celebrated by the Mayor of Paris and illuminating the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe, Paris' most iconic monuments, in green, therefore producing their own emissions. So in this one, I'm just going to go through the Wikipedia page because I was interested in the Paris Agreement. I didn't really know a lot about it, so let's read on, shall we? So the aim of the convention, as described in Article 2, is enhancing the implementation of the UNFCCC, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the impacts and risks of climate change. Increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster the resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. Making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Countries furthermore aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. The agreement has been described as an incentive for and driver of fossil fuel divestment. The Paris deal is the world's first comprehensive climate agreement. So, nationally determined contributions, NDCs. It requires them to be ambitious, represent a progression over time, and set with a view to achieving the purpose of this agreement. The contributions should be reported every 5 years and are to be registered by the Secretariat. Each further ambition should be more ambitious than the previous one, so progression. Countries can cooperate and pool their nationally determined contributions. The intended NDC pledged during the 2015 Climate Change Conference serve, unless otherwise provided, as the initial nationally determined contribution. The level of NDCs set by each country will set that country's targets. So they're setting their own NDCs. However, the contributions themselves are not binding as a matter of international law, as they lack specificity, normative character, or obligatory language necessary to create binding norms. Furthermore, there will be no mechanism to force a country to set a target in their NDC by a specific date, and no enforcement if a set target in an NDC is not met. There will be only a name and shame system, or as Janos Patzor, the UN Assistant Secretary General on Climate Change, told CBS News US, a name and encourage plan. As the agreement provides no consequences if countries do not meet their commitments, consensus of this kind is fragile. A trickle of nations exiting the agreement may trigger the withdrawal of more governments, bringing about a total collapse of the agreement. The negotiations of the agreement, however, stated that the NDCs and the 2% reduction target were insufficient. Instead, a 1.5 degree target is required, noting with concern that estimated aggregate greenhouse gas emissions levels in 2025 and 2030 resulting from the intended nationally determined contributions do not fall within least cost 2 degrees scenarios, but rather lead to a projected level of 55 gigatons in 2030, and recognizing furthermore that much greater emission reduction efforts will be required in order to hold the increase in global temperature average to below 2 degrees by reducing emissions to 40 gigatons or 1.5 degrees. Although not sustained temperatures over the long term to which the agreement addresses, in the first half of 2016, average temperatures were about 1.3 above the average in 1880 when global record keeping began. When the agreement reached enough signatures to cross a threshold in October 5th, 2016, Obama claimed that even if we meet every target, we will only get to part of where we need to go, and that this agreement will help delay or avoid some worse climate change. So none of it they have to do. They set their own targets within a sort of framework, and there's no consequences for anything they set. Global stocktake. The global stocktake will kick off with a facilitative dialogue in 2018. And it doesn't start until 2020. At this convening, parties will evaluate how their NDCs stack up to the nearer term realistic goal of peaking global emissions and long-term goal of achieving net zero emissions by the second half of this century. That's a big change. The implementation of the agreement by all member countries together will be evaluated every 5 years, with the first evaluation in 2023. I thought it started in 2020. Whatever, they're starting in 2018 or 2020. The outcome is to be used as input for new nationally determined contributions of member states. The stocktake will not be of contributions achievements of individual countries, but a collective analysis of what has been achieved and what more needs to be done. So they're just having a look at what's going to happen and how they can best do it. Structure. The Paris Agreement has a bottom-up structure in contrast to most international environmental law treaties which are top-down, characterized by standards and targets set internationally for states to implement. Unlike its predecessor, the Kyoto Protocol, which sets commitment targets that have legal force, the Paris Agreement, with its emphasis on consensus building, allows for voluntary and nationally determined targets, aka set your own target and you don't have to hit it. The specific climate goals are thus politically encouraged rather than legally bound. Another key difference between Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol is its scope. While the Kyoto Protocol differentiated between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, this bifurcation is blurred in the Paris Agreement, as all parties will be required to submit emission reduction plans, while the Paris Agreement still emphasizes the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The acknowledgement that different nations will have different capacities to duties to climate action. It does not provide a specific division between developed and developing nations. So obviously it's harder if developing countries want to continue to develop, they're not going to develop as quickly if they're going to cut emissions. But that's the same for the US. If they want to continue to be a powerhouse, it's a lot harder for them to reduce their levels to a zero framework, which is what they want by the second half of this century. Provisions and carbon markets. Linkages and ITMOs. So International Transfer of Mitigation Outcomes, ITMO. The agreement recognizes the rights of parties to use emission reductions outside of their own jurisdiction towards the NDC. This provision requires the linkage of various carbon emission trading systems. Because measured emissions reductions must avoid double counting, transferred mitigation outcomes must be recorded as a gain of emission units for one party and a reduction of emission units for the other. Okay, that one's a bit less interesting. So, well, I find it less interesting. Maybe I'm just getting article fatigue. The Sustainable Development Mechanism. The Sustainable Development Mechanism. I can't read. To contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gases and support of sustainable development. Though there is no specific name for the mechanism as yet, many parties and observers have informally coalesced around the name Sustainable Development Management, or SDM. SDM is considered to be the successor of the Clean Development Mechanism, a flexible mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol by which parties could collaboratively pursue emissions reductions for their INDCs. The Sustainable Development Management System lays the framework for the future of the Clean Development Mechanism post-Kyoto. In its basic aim, SDM will largely resemble the CDM. Article fatigue. Adaptation provisions. Adaptation issues garnered more focus in the Paris Agreement. Collective long-term adaptation goals are included in the agreement, and countries must report on their adaptation actions, making adaptation a parallel component of the agreement with mitigation. The adaptation goals focus on enhancing adaptive capacity, increasing resilience, and limiting vulnerability. Money, ensuring finance. Not part of the Paris Agreement and not legally binding is a plan to provide $100 billion a year in aid to developing countries for implementing the new procedures. Okay, so you're going to prop up, but when the rest of the world's in debt, how do you prop up low countries, poorer countries? Though both mitigation and adaptation require increased climate financing, adaptation has typically received a disproportionately low level of support. A 2014 report by the OECD found that just 16% of global finance was directed towards climate adaptation in 2014. That actually is more than I would expect. 16% of global finance was directed towards climate adaptation. But obviously, if we don't have a climate, then there's no economy to go inside of. Some specific outcomes of the elevated attention to adaptation financing in Paris include the G7 countries' announcement to provide $420 million for climate risk insurance and the launching of a climate risk and early warning systems initiative. Obama's administration gave $500 million to the Green Climate Fund in March 2016 as the first chunk of $3 billion commitment made to the Paris climate talks. So far, they've already received over $10 billion in pledges. Notably, the pledges come from developed nations like France, US, and Japan, but also from developing ones like Mexico, Indonesia, and Vietnam. They're also going to implement stuff to do with the damage from climate change. A new issue that emerged as a focal point in the Paris negotiations rose from the fact that many worse effects of climate change will be too severe or come too quickly to be avoided by adaptation measures, aka we've already crossed the line. The Paris Agreement specifically acknowledges the need to address loss and damage of this kind and aims to find appropriate responses. It specifies that loss and damage can take various forms: extreme weather events, loss of land, and low-lying islands as well. Have we gone too far? Is it too late? They're still going to try and compensate. Enhanced transparency framework. So it's not legally binding, but they want monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. Thus, both developed and developing nations must report every 2 years on their mitigation efforts, and all parties will be subject to both technical and peer review. But of course, this is flexible. Adoption. Negotiations within the UN, the UNFCCC, legal instruments may be adopted to reach the goals of the Convention. For the period of 2008-2012, greenhouse gas reduction methods were agreed in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The scope of the protocol was extended until 2020 with the Doha amendment to that protocol in 2012. At the conclusion of COP21, which is COP, which is the Conference of the Parties, which was in Paris, in 2015, the final wording of the Paris Agreement was adopted by consensus of all 195 member states and the EU to reduce emissions as part of the method for reducing greenhouse gases. The members promised to reduce their carbon output as soon as possible and to do their best to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Signature. So they didn't all sign. Some of them signed earlier, some of them signed later. United States signed, or said they would sign, April 2016, as did China. 175 parties and 174 states in the EU signed the treaty on the first date it was open for signature. On the same day, more than 20 countries issued a statement of their intent to join as soon as possible. 192 states have signed pretty much as of 2 months ago, and 127 of those parties have ratified, most notably China, US, and India, the countries with the 3 largest greenhouse emissions. The following member states are entitled to sign the Paris Agreement but have not done so: Nicaragua, Syria, and Uzbekistan. Critical reception. According to the UNEP, the emission cut targets will result in a temperature rise by 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is way above the 2 degrees agreed target. So even though they cut these emissions, which they're not going to reach, it's still going to be too high. Al Gore stated that no agreement is perfect and one must be strengthened over time, but groups across every sector of society will now begin to reduce dangerous carbon pollution through the framework of this agreement. Nature in 2016 said, current country pledges are too low to lead to a temperature rise below the Paris. And there's also lack of a binding enforcement mechanism, so people aren't going to follow it. It's just promises, but they're not firm commitments. So what can we do? What can you do on an individual basis? Obviously have shorter showers, ride your bike everywhere, don't leave the light on, turn off the tap, that kind of shit. But really, no surprise, if you eat less animal products, and if you choose, in season, locally grown fruits and veggies, then you're going to be better off. Other things you can do: not fly as much, using things that are second-hand, that includes sort of houses as well. Instead of building a new house, renovate one, or just live in an old one. All these things have big impacts. So reduce is the first one, reuse is the second one, and then recycle is the third one. If there's a fourth one, let me know. Thanks for listening to another Powerplant podcast. Bit dry, but I gained something out of reading this article. Hope you did too. Catch you next time.